Good afternoon, everybody. I know we're all happy to be back together and still chatting after a really lovely lunch discussion. Thank you, Martha, and the whole Hard Histories team for having us here and convening this really wonderful conference today. It's been amazing just to learn about the projects that everybody's working on and to see how we're all pushing our respective institutions forward. So our panel this afternoon is Changing Landscapes, which when our panel met to talk about this ahead of time, we didn't necessarily think about the landscape, so we're going to dive into that a little bit more today, just to admit that. My name is Savannah Wood. I'm Executive Director of Afro Charities. We're a nonprofit partner to the 131-year-old Afro-American Newspapers, which was founded here in Baltimore. And among other things, one of the main things that we do is to maintain the Afro-American newspapers archives and to make them more accessible to the public. And so as you can imagine, I'm sure many people in this room have used that resource. It is a really useful tool for looking at hard histories because it presents the history of the world really through Black perspectives, which is usually not the dominant narrative that we're given. So I've introduced myself. I'm going to ask each of these panelists to do the same, to introduce themselves and to talk about how their work fits into this hard histories approach, as well as where they are in that journey today. So David, if you could start.
Absolutely. Thank you everyone for being here today. Dr. Jones for inviting me, and Savannah for moderating along with my colleagues here. So I'm David Armenti, Vice President of Education and Engagement at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. And if you're not familiar with the name Maryland Center for History and Culture, especially if you've been around Maryland for a while, used to be known as the Maryland Historical Society. So already right there, evidence of change that's happened in recent years, and I'm happy to talk about some of the motivations and substantive pieces of that as well. But I would say that, just kind of get the conversation started, the main part of my work is through education. And, even thinking about the lunch conversation that we had here just a few minutes ago, and the kind of the various constituencies that somebody that works for a museum speaks to, or is beholden to some extent. Certainly having a board, having leadership, having other staff members that we're accountable to. But, for me, one of the main motivations and one of the often the greatest learning opportunities are with those students who walk through the door, with those educators who come for field trips, come for professional development, and even the chaperones, the parents, those community members who aren't necessarily coming with a lot of preconceived notions, but they're receiving the information in their own unique way. So I would say that through that educational work, particularly looking at United States history through the Maryland lens, as our institution does, it's almost every day that I'm faced with either a challenge to the content or the way it's presented, and we just have to take that very seriously as educators and museum educators, and make sure that we are, yes, leading with truth, but that's not always enough. Thinking about the framing of it and the way that it aligns with different modes of thinking. So I would just generally say that aspect of my work is often that the guiding light is how those individuals and those constituencies receive history, which is unique across the board.
I'm Lori Finkelstein. I am the director of JHU Museums. JHU has two museums that function as museums that are open to the public for programs and educational experiences and that have collections. And there's other museums that are part of the university as well. I'm responsible for the Evergreen Museum and Library and Homewood Museum. They're both historic houses. I'd like to thank Martha as well for inviting me today. And I'd also like to acknowledge that one of the members of the Homewood Museum Advisory Board, John Guest, is in the audience here today. And many of us had an opportunity to hear him speak last night. So hard histories really apply to both museums at the university, and that's part of the story of the university that we've been exploring today. And there are also independent stories from the university. A lot of attention has been given recently to the stories at Homewood Museum because in around 2018, that museum began to start to tell a fuller and more inclusive story of not just the Carroll family who owned and built that property, but the approximately 25 people whom they enslaved on that property. And I became the director there during the pandemic, and that is a story that we continue to tell and that we are continuing to broaden and explore more deeply. But it's not the only museum with a hard history, because Evergreen itself has a challenging history, and it's a history that we've not explored very much and that we want to start to address as well. And it is a difficult history that's connected to the history of Baltimore City. It is a history that results from the fact that the house was built in 1858, and we know nothing about who built it, who did the labor. We know very little about who was living on the property and around the property in the 1850s and in the 1860s. And there's just a lot of unanswered stories about both those properties. And someone asked me earlier today, oh, you know, is it a challenging job to be responsible for two historic houses that don't relate to each other, don't connect? And they actually do connect. They're both along Charles Street. There's many more areas of intersection than, what's the opposite of intersection? Disintersection? Not intersecting. And one of the projects that we're really trying to do is use these two houses as an opportunity to tell a fuller, broader story of Baltimore City history, not just in terms of architecture, not just in terms of the collections that were amassed by wealthy people connected to both houses, but also what does it say about the landscape? That's good, right? What does it say about the landscape of the city that these two prominent in terms of architecture and the space that they occupy structures still exist? Why were they both saved? And what are the different ways that they have been saved? Why did the university choose to keep them? And how did the university choose to use them? And what responsibility do we have today to use them in, I want to say newer and better ways, that's probably trite, but in more inclusive and open and welcoming ways than perhaps they've been used in the past?
Good afternoon. My name is Elgin Clue. I'm a professor at Coppin State University in the social science department. My area is anthropology. But I'm also serving as the chair of the Laurel Cemetery Memorial Project. So for those who may not be aware, this is an effort to memorialize a cemetery that is hidden within the landscape, that is significant, very significant to Baltimore's history. I'd like to recognize one of our founding board members, Ms. Beverly Carter, who is here today. And she has been with this project since its inception and very supportive. This Laurel Cemetery has an interesting connection to Johns Hopkins. You're familiar with Clifton Park and Clifton Mansion. Directly across the street is the Bel Air Edison Crossing Shopping Center right off of Bel Air Road right now. That is the exact location and the exact space of the former Laurel Cemetery, which was founded in 1852 as a non-sectarian cemetery for Baltimore's African American population, and was in existence, continued operation until around 1957 or so, and when it was condemned, sold, and demolished, and a shopping center was constructed in the early 60s. So an unknown number of burials that existed there. We don't have the records. The original records are lost. But we have partnered with the Baltimore Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society, and we're currently conducting a death certificate transcription project where we can, we're combing through all the Baltimore City death certificates from when they started in 1875 to when the cemetery was closed. So we're looking at over 1 million death certificates. And we've only gotten through about 30% of the ones that we need to go through, but we've already documented over 20,000 Laurel Cemetery burials. And we estimate that we expect to find at least about double that number in the total burials at that site. So officially, Laurel Cemetery was moved to Carroll County in a site that's unfortunately not been cared for. And that movement consisted of moving roughly about 600 headstones and very little in terms of human remains. So much of Laurel Cemetery, these burials remain under the parking lot, and I can say that with confidence because we have gone out there and done the archaeology, we've done the ground penetrating radar, we've done the archaeological excavation, and we have encountered remains. So this is what my effort, my desire, my goal is to really correct this absence on the landscape. I want to make sure that there's something there in the historical record. We've added to the literature by writing a book about Laurel Cemetery, but also I want individuals who visit that site to see historic signage, to see something respectfully acknowledging the history of these individuals who strived and did so much in the creation of this city.
Thank you so much. There's a lot just in that introduction to dive into. So we're talking about places that have a physical space, that they're physically represented in the landscape, and then we're also talking about the absence, which I think is always part of this conversation that we're dealing with hard histories, is what is actually in the record and what it can't be found, that we have to kind of imagine what was there. Why was it left out? What are those violences that we've talked about earlier of that erasure? One of the things that I'd love to hear more about, we heard a bit about at the Maryland Center for History and Culture, for instance, the name change that's happening, to understand a little bit more about how that change came about, why, and when this self-examination started to happen within your organization. Similarly for the Hopkins Museums, understanding a bit more about why there was this shift in telling the story and how that started to happen. I know it predates your time there, but still, if you could talk a bit about that. And then Elgin, when we get to you, I'd love to hear a bit about how you learned about the Laurel Cemetery, and what your engagement has been with that, why it struck a chord with you, why you chose to get involved, as well as how this revelation is being received by the bodies that have done this work. Okay, so whoever wants to start really can jump in. We don't have to go in a line. Okay, I'm going to say David then.
Sure. So as I mentioned, the Maryland Center for History and Culture used to be known as the Maryland Historical Society. This is an institution that has been around since 1844. It has had many iterations of its mission. But, as with some of the other organizations that were, discussed earlier, started with a 100% white male board, founders who came with a specific purpose to conserve Maryland history and United States history. But of course, what that history encompassed was, in the mind of those, or in the lens of those individuals that were starting that practice. But over the years, accumulating records, getting into the 20th century and becoming more of a educational institution as it is today, it became obviously much clearer that presenting more of a diverse history was going to be necessary for respect and to be a part of the community, but also, for survival, to expand beyond that dominant narrative, not just of white male Marylanders, but the very elite, quote, of white Maryland and those individuals whose records were deemed worthy of being preserved. So that's kind of the origination of the institution and where it had to grow and come from. The thought about renaming or rebranding, this was actually not the first time that the institution had undergone that process. As far as I know, I believe there was also in the 1990s an effort to do the same thing. And part of the idea around that, as we moved into this modern era, 2018 through 2019, those conversations were starting internally, was that, there are preconceptions or connotations around the name Historical Society. And frankly, we've seen other institutions around the country, the Virginia Historical Society most notably, who underwent a similar process. And what we hope, and the ongoing work that has to happen, is that this is not just a change in name only, right? It's very easy to I wouldn't say it's very easy. It's actually a laborious process to change the name from a logistical standpoint, all the behind the scenes and signage and all that sort of stuff. But it is easy to say, oh, our name has changed, so we're different now, right? Don't judge us by what happened a year ago or 150 years ago, because we're not that anymore. I think that's a mistake. I think that's a naive way of looking at it. So, it was a starting point. It was to some extent, a symbolic move to say, we are moving away from that impression or that kind of mission that historical society invokes. This is a center. This is a place that people can come and learn. This is a place that does not require a membership to walk in the door. So trying to break down that perception of exclusivity, and then, for me and my team and my colleagues to practically make that a reality. So it's not just something that we're saying. So, I'm proud of that transition and that ongoing work, but certainly recognizing that, going from one name to the other in 2020, also not a great time to undergo a rebrand. But just changing the name isn't really going to do much unless you're serious about the work and you have people in the fold who really take that seriously and are going to go out and do that collaborative work, make people feel welcome, open up seats at the table, so to speak, and do that real substantive work. So, that's kind of the backdrop for it. And, like I said, that's certainly ongoing.
The museum around 2018 began, as I mentioned, to tell a more inclusive story. And the question was, where did that come from? What prompted that? Before I answer that, I want to make 2 points. One is I'm uncomfortable being celebratory about the fact that we're telling the history that happened in the house, because that's what we should be doing. And I also want to point out that Homewood was a late adopter in the museum world and in the historic house world of telling inclusive stories about all the people who lived in the house and the hierarchies of what happened in the house and the hard and difficult, and in the case of Homewood, brutal histories of what happened in that house. And I think the work we're doing is important, and I don't want to minimize that, but I think it's work that needs to be done, and we need to keep doing it. And I think questions have been asked earlier in this panel about, so what next or what now? There's plenty more we can do in terms of reaching more audiences and talking about the whole long history of that house. Because the history of the house is not just the story of the Carrolls, who lived there really just for a very brief time between 1801 and the 1830s. The history of that house continues. So to go backwards, the house was built in 1801. The Carroll family, husband and wife, live there with their children and with upwards of 25 people whom they enslave. And then the house eventually gets sold to another family, the Wyman family, and work is happening at Hopkins now, and there's people in the audience who can speak more to it than I can about the Wyman family and their ownership of the property and their construction of another house on another part of the Hopkins property down the road. And there's an interesting story about Charles Street there and the relationship to Evergreen, because one of the reasons that the Wymans choose to move their house to another part of the property is that Charles Street gets opened up and it's now no longer a country villa. It is a house in an increasing bustling city. So I think there's stories there about urbanization and landscape and space that are worth digging into, maybe at another time. And so the house becomes, it's a residence for a while, it gets rented out, other families live there, and then Hopkins begins to design a campus on this piece of land that the Wyman family built. And I have to say, we've got the retrospective people sitting here in the audience, so I'm just going to acknowledge that I'm not the expert on the history of the university, just my little piece of it. So Allison, anyone else jump in if I'm getting anything wrong. And the university by 1901 is designing this campus, and they make Homewood a centerpiece of it because it is a historic house, and it was paid for by a signer of the Declaration of Independence, Charles Carroll, for his son. And so there's already a history there, right, about what we are considering primary, what is important to this American narrative and the creation of this university. There's an early plan of the university that shows, if you know the Hopkins Bowl, that Homewood sits on one side of it, and there was this idea of making another structure that looked exactly like it on the other side of the campus to mirror it, and that would be the president's house. So this structure is being elevated, I think, because of this Declaration of Independence connection. And then the house serves many different functions for the university. It's administrative offices, there's some student housing there. It has two incarnations as a museum, one in the 1920s and one in the 1930s that are very much about the colonial revival. And in 1971, it was basically it was administrative offices, and a decision was made to reinterpret it as a full-on historic house, telling the story of the Carroll family who had lived there, and to furnish it with fine antiques and objects, very much in this keeping of American history, a suspension of disbelief. So we're going to walk through this house, and we're going to imagine that the Carrolls just put down their lovely teacup and, you know, just finished having a meal, and no mention of who was facilitating this entire theater that's unfolding. And we know who's facilitating that. We know whose labor is being forcefully used to extract these almost theatrical experiences that are being recreated. And the people are not talked about, the enslaved people are not mentioned. And it takes us a long time at that museum to get to that point. And as I said at the beginning, we were late adopters of that, because there's many museums who had paved the way generations beforehand, and we're there, and we're going to keep doing the work. But I think it is important to acknowledge that part of the hard history of Homewood isn't just the hard history of the enslavement that took place there, but it's also the hard history of how long it took us to tell that story, if we're speaking honestly.
How I got involved in the project, and was there a second part to that question?
We can start there.
Okay. Well, as an anthropologist, I've always kind of been interested in landscapes and what they say and what they don't say, and the power and politics behind that. I had no particular interest in cemeteries, but you know, I looked at other cases of, you know, the discussion going on about Confederate monuments, and I was fascinated by the story Michelin Drew told about his time as mayor in New Orleans and what he went through in taking down the Confederate monuments there. These stories interested me, but I always was curious about what monuments need to be going up. What's missing? What stories aren't being told? You know, we can talk about the placement of certain things that are there. Maybe some things need to be moved someplace else, but what's absent? I was working with Ron Costanzo, who is an archaeologist. He's over at the University of Baltimore. He and I are the only anthropologists at our respective institutions. So we were looking to get our students together and involved in an archaeological project. And he's the one who saw the cemetery on the old maps, because he was familiar with the Clifton Park area and saw this rather sizable cemetery called the Laurel Cemetery, but knew the area and knew that it wasn't there anymore. So we just decided to go out there and do a project to train students in archaeological methods, not necessarily knowing the full scope of what we were getting into. We wanted to, you know, we figured that there were burials there because there was a couple news articles that said about 300 or so burials had been moved, and the cemetery had been there operating for over 100 years, so it didn't make sense that there was only that few. So we went out there and we did ground penetrating radar. We did archaeological excavation. Yes, we did find the existence. We found burials still existent on that site. And so the other thing that was interesting about what we found was the absence of knowledge about the site, because we were kind of in a public space doing archaeology right along Bel Air Road in the grassy area between the busy city street and the parking lot. And we got the tents up, and we got all the equipment out, and people were kind of walking by, looking at us curiously, and some of them stopped by and kind of said, "What are you guys doing?" But we did not meet a single person out there any of those Saturdays over a couple of years that we were out there who knew anything about the history of that cemetery site. And we met many people who said, well, I grew up here. I live right over in this neighborhood next door, and I'd never heard of this. They were dumbfounded, and some of them were actually kind of mad, that they had not heard that history. So a major mission for me became what we call phase 2 of the project, which we're deeply embedded in now, is to simply make sure that we inform the public about the existence of this site. And that has been such a rich journey through this history that is continuing to go on. Like I mentioned, we have our book that came out in March, A Place for Memory, Baltimore's Historic Laurel Cemetery, and we have a newsletter that we continue to push out because we couldn't include all the history just in the one book. So we continue to explore different biographies in the quarterly newsletter, and we are working with the city to be responsible for the care of what we want to call Laurel Cemetery Memorial Park. There's about that half-acre green space where we did a lot of the archaeology, where ground-penetrating radar found the existence of about 200 grave shafts still there today, is where we've worked with the property owner, and he's agreed to let us call that Laurel Cemetery Memorial Park, where we want to put some historic signage and put up a memorial. So this has really been a journey for me. I didn't know what I was getting into at first, but it has been one of the most enriching projects of my life thus far. So.
I can empathize with that. I don't know what I'm getting into. You start digging and then you're like, ooh, okay, here we go. We've been talking about these sites that hold so much history, whether it's visible or not, and the different layers of time and the people who have moved through these spaces, the activities that have been within these walls, the ways that we've interpreted and imagined these places. And now here in the present, we're in the role to do that work. And so I wonder just how you bring yourself and your interests into this work, how you recharge, how you deal with the emotional labor that's involved in interpreting this history, and what you might offer to other practitioners by way of, taking breaks or whatever tools you're using to move through this work that can be so heavy. And Elgin, I know you just spoke, but I'm going to start with you so that we can bring it back this way and switch it up a little bit.
I would say it's interesting that recharging is important, and you do come to these points where you realize that there is energy being drained, and you need to kind of self-assess. And I would say, for me, in that manner, I was working on this project, and I had to get comfortable in a space where I'm thinking about kind of death, right? Because you're dealing with a cemetery and looking at the history of all these funeral homes and the stories of these burials. But at the center of it all, you're talking about something that's not the most cheery subject. So I reframed my approach, mentally speaking, and I'm not necessarily exploring the cemetery. I'm exploring the lives of the people who were buried there, and that's what's inspiring and super fascinating. But it was something that I had to come to grips with. I first got to know David because we were working together on the Maryland Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And so my work with that kind of started at the same time with my work on Laurel Cemetery. And that was another heavy one because you're dealing with the history of lynching, and that's not a comfortable history to think about. And I came to a point where I realized, so much of my mental energy was concentrated on this project where I was kind of looking at cemeteries and death, and this other project where I was looking at the history of lynching, and it was, I had to step back a little bit and think about how I could reframe it and what I could really handle, so.
So how do we recharge after engaging with difficult
It's a few
history?
things. I mean, we already talked a bit about how you're approaching the work of interpreting the history of the places that you're working within. But part of it is just what aspects of yourself are you bringing to that work? And then how do you hold this history in your own body, and how do you move through it?
Thank you. So I'm trained as a social historian, PhD in U.S. history, from the time period that I interpret at both houses, so 19th century U.S. history. And I think, you know, part of the recharging or addressing is just sort of digging into the research and uncovering those facts. And to what Monica, I think, was speaking about this morning, trying to fill in those gaps and feeling a responsibility to doing so as accurately as possible. But I also acknowledge that the difficult history that I have been given the privilege to interpret and to share with others is not my own difficult history. I'm very cognizant of that. And sometimes it makes me uncomfortable or self-conscious to be speaking about histories that aren't my histories, that are other people's histories. And it also makes me anxious. And I think I vacillate between two types of anxiety. So one anxiety is that I'm not going to accurately and fairly and thoughtfully enough represent someone else's difficult history, and I'm going to make a gaffe. And that if I do, I'm not going to apologize or solve it in the right way. And then the other anxiety is that I'm going to maybe upset, offend people who are not comfortable with the new history that I'm telling. And then I double back on that anxiety with, I shouldn't be anxious about that because I'm really doing what I should be doing. And it's this like, sometimes this loop of unease. And other times it's just a privilege to be able to know that I work at a university that has given me the time and the resources, and that I, in my own education, had the opportunity and the resources to get to pursue a PhD so that I can use my skills to look at the facts, right? And sort of use, not facts, evidence, really dig into the evidence and let that guide me. And so I think that's the solve.
Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate the responses from both of my colleagues here and would co-sign them. I would add that, you know, on what I bring to the work personally, I think it's important, you know, and for me, part of what grounds me and makes this so important, you know, I am a native of Baltimore City, somebody who went through public schools here, you know, the child of educators, you know, somebody who's lived the majority of my life here in a variety of different circumstances and seen and experienced a lot. So, you know, the work is always personal for me. It's not, you know, whether I'm telling, you know, whether I'm working through stories that are my own or quote my community, you know, that can inform it. But, you know, ultimately, this is the city that I claim as mine, and I feel that identity with it and with the state of Maryland is extremely important to me. So that's with me every day. The other aspect of it, and the thing that, you know, either grounds me or, you know, allows me to kind of deal with some of that emotional turmoil that comes with, you know, addressing really hard histories on a regular basis are those personal interactions with the various individuals that come through the doors, or, you know, folks that I meet at events like these. And that doesn't mean that it's, you know, the pat on the back or the, you know, the thank you that is going to sustain you. Sometimes it is the challenging questions. You know, sometimes it is, you know, the call out to what I think might be right, and, you know, causing that mental pivot in a way that is uncomfortable, but it is productive. And, you know, somebody who leads tours, does professional development, you know, it might be a 9 or 10-year-old that is looking you in the face and calling you out for the way that information is being presented or the lack of information on a particular perspective. And it's, you know, especially for me, you know, it's not productive to have that any sort of defensive posture. You know, I think somebody in the morning session may have mentioned that as well, that, you know, it's our duty as educators and those that interact with the public to be responsive, to listen, and not just pretend like, we're the ultimate purveyors of truth, although, people do look to museums for that to some extent. So I would say that whether it's with a young person, whether it's with an educator, sometimes the same thing that will, kind of knock you on your bottom a little bit there, is the same thing that can then produce the actual, productive work in the field and make you look at things a different way, and then, ultimately make the change that the public is asking you to respond to. So it does, that sort of back and forth is what, really allows me to do my work, even if it is often uncomfortable.
Thank you. I'm really glad you brought up Baltimore and being a native Baltimorean, because everybody who's in here, for the most part, is dealing with issues related to this city. And so you also said something that was interesting, just about being held accountable here is a good catalyst for the work. I also think there's an opportunity, since Baltimore is relatively small and the community is pretty tight-knit, for repair to happen between people. So if you do something in a way that might offend, that there should be a way for us to hold each other accountable and in love still, and with the aim of making everybody better. That's me being an optimist. But I want to know from your perspectives, what makes Baltimoreans unique in this approach to hard histories? What is it about our history in this city that makes this project really important or viable or engaging, dynamic, any of those things? What brings the hard histories question to life, specifically within this context? And I'm going to ask you to start this time, Lori.
We actually were talking about this at lunch, and Baltimore is this geographically pretty small city, population-wise pretty small city, but there is so much interconnection among the different cultural institutions in this town. It has to do with the interconnections among the elites who built them and who funded them, and among the non-elites who worked them and made them run. And I think those of us who have come to hold positions in those institutions are cognizant of those connections and want to pull them out and make them more obvious. And I think that there's a tremendous amount of opportunity for collaboration, for more collaboration than there already is. But I think there's a lot of good foundational work already happening there. I would say just today, I made a connection with a colleague who we're going to, hopefully work together on understanding the boundaries between Loyola University and the back of Evergreen, because part of Evergreen was sold to Loyola. So, and a lot of that work can take place in forums like this. And I saw flashing above us earlier today was the announcement for the Be More Historic Unconference. And that's another fantastic place to go and make those connections. And I think there is an opportunity to speak concretely in this city to maybe start to think about a project that makes connections among all the sites that are talking about the history of enslavement, and to recognize them either through markers, through commemoration, through programs that on the landscape make these visible connections, that this city, if you take a map and you dot all those lines, is deeply interconnected by a very hard history.
Obviously I'm biased about Baltimore, so we can start with that. Been here my whole life, obviously came back and, have my professional career here, have my family here. So it's, obviously a wonderful place. And I think a lot of people in the room probably are aware of the unique history of Baltimore. Lori alluded to the philanthropic community, which, we see represented, whether it's Johns Hopkins University or the former Maryland Historical Society. A lot of the same individuals that were, making their money in a variety of ways, some less honorable than others, were contributing to this philanthropic cultural infrastructure, which I think is still an existing asset for us, as long as we understand, the ways that we need to shift and change to make them productive for everyone. So that in and of itself, I think, even in traveling to different places and, hearing from colleagues in other cities, I think that is particularly unique, the way that we had that robust community, right or wrong, in terms of what they were able to establish here. And then, of course, you have the racial and social history of Baltimore being a place where you had the largest free black population prior to the Civil War. You had luminaries, such as Frederick Douglass, Thurgood Marshall. I mean, the list could go on, but it's important to call out those names, but also call out the collective of, the intellectual power that these communities had amongst the African American community, at large throughout the city, and what that was able to then produce coming into the 20th century, even if they weren't always getting the credit or the funding or the things to build their own infrastructure before things became more integrated. So, the groundwork of what was established here, before any of us came around, allowed for some of these opportunities, even if that meant, again, we have to grow out of the kind of restrictive and exclusive nature of some of the institutions that were established here. But it being a small city, us having these various forums to talk with each other and collaborate with each other. I mean, I think between us on stage, we've probably had 7 to 8 projects that kind of overlap between each other. That says something about, not just geography, but our willingness and our attitude toward collaboration and trying to move forward in the place that we all are proud of and want to be more proud of. So, that's my 2 cents as a native Baltimorean, but there's certainly that sort of opportunity, and I think that's really special here.
And I agree. That's, I'm not a native Baltimorean. I'm not from that far away. I'm from Silver Spring, but it was far enough away not to know much about Baltimore until I came and put in a job application here. And but I've been here working at Coppin State now. This is year 17, I believe. And from what I've learned, it just seems natural that Baltimore would be on the forefront, because the history I've learned is that Baltimore has always been on the forefront, especially this history with Laurel Cemetery, and seeing, in terms of civil rights and the stories that go back so much further than, starting in the 30s with maybe you could look at Charles Hamilton Houston at Howard Law School and what he did, but some of those legal strategies had their beginnings here back in the 1880s and so forth, with people like Reverend Harvey Johnson, individuals who I found out about because they were buried at Laurel Cemetery. And you can go back even further to the 1870 parade where they celebrated the black men getting the right to vote, and all the individuals who worked before that parade to make sure that people did get the right to vote. Baltimore has been on the forefront of civil rights history and quite a bit of progressive history in this nation, on the forefront of maybe a few other things too. But, but it just seems natural to me that this could start here and that Baltimore can birth something that provides leadership for others to follow.
So coming back to our topic of landscapes, we see so many prominent Maryland names on street signs, on buildings. You mentioned the philanthropic community and how we can see their names on buildings all over town. I wonder, in the work that you're doing, and obviously, Elgin, you're working at a university that bears the name of somebody, a black person who's making change in Baltimore, but so often the names that we see are from white slaveholders who are represented prominently throughout the city. And as we're talking about the landscape, the city of Baltimore, and the work that each of you are doing, in the histories that you're bringing to the forefront, how are those names or those stories being represented within the physical space that you're inhabiting, or even the city at large, through the work that you're doing? And Elgin, I know you alluded to this earlier with making that a memorial park specifically, but if you could maybe elaborate a little bit on that, and then we can pass it on to Lori and David.
I think names is really emerging to be a really important part of my project, because we're kind of mining names that have not been spoken in quite a while. And I'm still learning the significance and impact of the individuals that we're learning about. in the histories that we're telling. So, you know, at one point, these names were chiseled in stone by family members and friends and congregations who thought these memorials were going to be there forever. And then they weren't. And, you know, public memory can be fickle. But what I really want to do is make sure that we create a space where these names are present and can be spoken about and folded back into the mainstream narrative of Baltimore's history. So names is a essential part of this project. And one of the things in the book I wanted to do was, like, when we were looking at just an example, when we created the index, I wanted to include everybody's name in the index, even though if the mention of the name was in passing and it wasn't necessarily that significant in terms of the story that was told about that person in the book. I thought it was just important to make sure that we had the names in print as much as possible, because these are descendants, they're descendants who are going to go looking for their ancestors' names. And as much as we can uplift and tell those names, that's that's a priority for me.
Thank you. Lori, do you want to go next?
So when Homewood Museum began to tell a new and a more inclusive story, one of the things the director at the time did was create a wall of remembrance where we list the names of everyone we've identified who've been enslaved on that site. And when you come into the museum, it's in the main hallway. And I think that's an important first step. There's more names we haven't identified, and it's because at this point, the historical record, we can't find the information yet. That doesn't mean we shouldn't keep looking. On the Evergreen side, we're really silent about the names of the people in the house who weren't the family members who lived there. And we are going to start to do more work there on the servants in the house. So that house is interpreted to the late 19th and early 20th century. So there were not people who were enslaved there that we know of at all, even in the earlier time period, that we need to do more research in that regard. But acknowledging the names of the domestic servants who worked there, many of whom were most of whom we think were the children of Irish immigrants. So I think there's a lot of opportunities to put names out there, maybe not inscribed, but also names in the context of a tour. And when you're walking through a historic house, with us, it's either through a guided tour, through an audio tour. We're communicating information verbally and making that commitment to verbally convey the names of all the people we know, to talk about their stories, to make these humans a part of the fabric of the house is really important. And I would say in the historic house world, in the world of interpretation, and listen for this when you visit other historic houses, what are the first names that you hear? And it's sometimes really challenging to undo that narrative. So if you come to Homewood, you come on a tour with me, the first name I probably say is Charles Carroll of Homewood. And I need to think about that. Is that the name I want to start my tour with? And so I think it's about acknowledging names, and I also think it's about the order of names and who we choose to privilege in what order on a tour. So thank you for asking that, because I hadn't really thought about that until you brought it up. So thank you.
Before you start, I just want to say we're at the end right now, so if you have questions percolating, to try to bring them to the forefront after David responds, we'll go to audience questions.
And there are a lot of different directions that I can take this, so I'll try to be as brief as I can. But even connecting to Lori's site, motivates me to think about some of the interpretation as well as educational programming at our site. Thinking about names like Charles Carroll, the signer of the Declaration of Independence, who also the only Catholic signer of the Declaration, who also happened to be one of the largest enslavers and landowners of the state, if not the whole, fledgling nation as it was being created at that time. And that interpretive twist is represented in our Unfinished Revolution gallery, where, yes, you see, the portrait, I believe it's a Charles Wilson Peale portrait, but at the same time having that juxtaposed to the ledger of, over 300 enslaved individuals around the 1770s. So it's, again, work is not done, but to at least, provide that fuller lens and that nuance to an individual who certain things get honored, certain things need to be called out and, brought as part of the narrative. And again, the opportunity to name individuals who, couldn't speak for themselves at various times. So that's part of the work for sure. The Maryland Center sits on land that was owned by John Eager Howard. Those are names that are on the landscape. I believe there's a John Eager and Howard Street that kind of straddle the area of Mount Vernon, our neighbor Bolton Hill. And if folks know the history of those neighborhoods as well, they were the largest enslaving areas of Baltimore City, where, yes, certainly we understand the free black population was large, but that doesn't mean that those political divisions weren't there. Folks that joined and or supported the Confederacy were in and around that neighborhood, and that legacy could be felt, within the doors of the Maryland Historical Society and its membership and its founders and leadership early on. So it's a very real and visceral thing at times when you're occupying those spaces or moving through those spaces, and that's certainly important. And furthermore, I want to acknowledge and thank, especially Michelle Wright, we heard from this morning, as well as some of our other colleagues that are doing research on behalf of other institutions, which I know is work that our institution has to do itself, but looking at us as a research facility as well as one of the tools for a community college of Baltimore County or McDonough or University of Maryland, Baltimore or Goucher, some of these local institutions that have been very deliberate about investigating the labor and the land that they're on. Well, we know who owned that land and where did their records often land? Well, in our research library. So not just being a passive participant, but, really trying to be deliberate about our collaborations and creating greater accessibility so that our neighbors and our partners and other folks in the community can do their work as well, using some of those resources. So I see a lot of opportunity, a lot of, I think, small ways that we've supported that, but certainly a lot more chances in the future to be a great partner and resource on that aspect.
Thank you, and thanks to everybody. If there are any questions, you could raise your hand in the audience. Got one up front.
Hello. My question is to you, Elgin. Savannah talked about accountability. What accountability have our mayor and our governor? I haven't heard them announce anything or say anything in regard to those more than 20,000 people that are still buried there. Seems as though that our governor left 20,000 people behind. So what has been their response to this? And my second question, could you please tell these people what happens when it rains at Laurel Cemetery?
Okay. Well, I'll start with the low-hanging fruit there. When it rains, there's a little issue with erosion. So that's one of the things we want to do in terms of the integrity of the site. We want to do a retaining wall along, 'cause there's a little slope down to the sidewalk, and the erosion just goes all over the sidewalk. And, erosion at a cemetery does not necessarily bode well for what could potentially be exposed. So there's a little bit of urgency to that. In terms of our elected officials, one of the hard histories about that cemetery is the story of its closure, of how it could be demolished. And demolished in a way wherein the descendants learned about the demolition by visiting their ancestors' graves and seeing bulldozers. Right? It wasn't like they knew ahead of time. And so they actually tried to sue to stop it, but were unsuccessful in those suits. And we find in that history that there were city officials at that time in the city solicitor's office who were in on this. They saw an opportunity to take a rundown cemetery that was not in the best condition and partner up with the gentleman who owned it. The cemetery was never owned by anybody who was African American. It was a gentleman who was basically a real estate investor who owned it at that time. and did not have an interest in maintaining a cemetery. He was looking to profit off of land. So these individuals in the city solicitor's office formed their own side company with this guy who owned the cemetery, and then in their professional lives had the cemetery condemned and valued at $100, and then bought it with the company that they created on the side, and then over the next 20 years profited in today's money over about $3 million off of that piece of property. So that was an amazing investment when you think about it. But it was just completely unethical, narrowly legal, and there's a whole nother story because they were involved in creating some of the laws that made what they did legal. So there is some accountability there in terms of what the city can do to kind of make amends for the past deeds of city officials who were so involved in the destruction of such a historic site. We have had some preliminary conversations with individuals within Baltimore City government, and they have been positive in their earnest interest in the site and wanting to do something. We don't have anything on paper yet, so there's nothing to stand up and proudly announce just yet, but we do hope that the city will agree to maintain and hold the historic easement for the Laurel Cemetery Memorial Park in perpetuity. And we do want to bring this to the mayor, to the governor, and want to make sure that he's aware of this history also.
Is it okay if I chime in on the government accountability piece, even offshoot of that? I've heard a lot of conversations today about curriculum, restrictions, depending on where you're coming from, community members combating what they think is important in terms of presenting history. I would like to think that we're lucky here in Maryland that we don't have as much of a restrictive view of what history should be presented in classrooms. But at the same time, we have educators who, even if they're, depending on where you are in the state, yes, there is resistance, and they can get backlash from community members, but also feeling that they are equipped enough to talk about the same things that we talk about on a regular basis as historians and museum professionals. So I think, pressing our legislators on curriculum is important, but also focusing on, some of the relationships that we already have. The Maryland State Department of Education is located in Baltimore City. These are not people who are out of our reach or out of touch with what the community needs and what the history is. So leveraging the relationships that we have, among those agencies, I think can be very practically productive. And again, the nature of collaboration amongst our institutions, I think professional development, working with a city school systems around the state, that's something I've been really proud of, and I think that really goes a long way is, equipping our educators to do that work when they're not always going to be able to come to your historic site every day of the week to teach this history. So collaborate with our government agencies, collaborate with our school learning agencies, and that can really take us places as well.
I think we could do a couple more.
Yeah, there's one question from Zoom for you too, Dr. Klug. Linda Davis asks whether there's been a conversation about reparations for descendants of Laurel Cemetery.
We haven't really gone into a discussion of the idea of reparations. I guess the word I had been looking more is the idea of reconciling the landscape. And I've been focused more on the landscape and the city, providing the city an opportunity to make amends by holding some responsibility and perhaps ponying up some funding to help make sure that landscape is secure and that this history is memorialized. But I'm open to these conversations. But no, we have not necessarily used that particular R word yet in our exploration.
It seems also that could be something that comes from descendants, if that's something that they're interested in also. That you have a portion of the work that's yours and you're highlighting and bringing this story to light, finding the names, but there's other people who can contribute to this work also.
Correct.
Anybody else, any questions? Okay, thank you so much for being here today, and thank you again, Dr. Jones and team. Thanks to the panelists. All right.
Thank you. Thank you.